Good afternoon. My name is Alan Detloff. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm very honored and proud to serve as Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. And on behalf of the Graduate College of Social Work and the Center for the Study of Social Policy, I'd like to welcome you back to day 2 of our inaugural upEnd convening, exploring the road to abolition of the child welfare system. At the Graduate College of Social Work, our vision is to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice for all. We work toward achieving that vision through the education we provide our students, through the research our faculty engage in, and through movements like upEnd, where we engage in critical work to challenge our systems, and particularly our role as social workers within those systems. As social workers, it's our responsibility to speak out and to stand up against the racism and white supremacy that exist in our systems. As social workers, we're called to challenge injustice and to fight against oppression. And it's because of our calling to challenge injustice and fight against oppression that we as social workers must fight to end the systems that perpetuate and maintain that oppression. As we discussed yesterday, the child welfare system disproportionately harms Black and Native children and families through systemic surveillance, separation, and the resulting harmful outcomes associated with foster care. And despite decades of attempts at reform, the harm to Black and Native families continues. It's time to acknowledge that reforms cannot right a fundamental wrong. The harm that results from this system and the oppression it perpetuates will only end when this system no longer exists, when the forcible separation of children from their families is no longer viewed as an acceptable intervention, and when we can envision a society where families are strengthened and supported rather than surveilled and separated. As my colleague from the Center for the Study of Social Policy, Kristen Weber, said yesterday, the work of abolition is not about replacing the existing child welfare system with another system. By abolition, we mean the elimination of the current child welfare and foster care systems, which are built on a model of surveillance and separation of families, and a fundamental reimagining and recreating of the ways in which we support children, families, and communities. I mentioned yesterday that I began my career as a social worker working inside what has historically been called the child welfare system, but is more accurately known as the family regulation or family policing system. I conducted child maltreatment investigations and was responsible for removing children from their parents. And when I was in the system, I thought I was doing good. I thought I was helping children and families. It wasn't until after I left the system when I was able to realize that I was very young, I was very ill-prepared, and I became caught up in a culture of removal, where forcibly separating children from their families was viewed as help. And I was completely blind to my own biases that were impacting the decisions I made and to the unnecessary harm I was causing these families. But when I was working in the system, that was never discussed. No one talked about the harm that foster care causes. No one talked about the trauma that children experience when they're forcibly separated from their parents. And when I was working in the system, no one talked about the deep problem of racism and racial bias that exist in the system. I didn't even learn about the problem of racial disproportionality and the harm that disproportionality causes until after I left the system. So that's why we're here today, to challenge the narrative that forcibly and violently separating families is help, to lift up the voices of those with lived experience who've been impacted by the system, and to reimagine what it means to care for children. My own process of understanding the problem of racism in the system and the harm it causes, and my own complicity in contributing to that harm, is what's motivated me to be engaged in this work to this day. And for me, that understanding came about largely because of the work of Dorothy Roberts. Shortly after I left the system and became involved in the state of Texas's efforts to address disproportionality as I was entering into a PhD program, I read Shattered Bonds. And reading Shattered Bonds and reflecting on my time in the system and understanding my role in contributing to the harm that Shattered Bonds talks about changed my life, changed my career, and it's the reason why I feel so fortunate to be involved in this movement. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the groundbreaking contribution that Dr. Roberts' work has made to this movement and to my own professional journey. And now to today's program. We begin today with a panel that talks about some of the efforts going on in Indian country to support tribal connections and restoration of culture and cultural ties for Native children and families. Well, on day 1, we talked about reimagining what it means to care for children and families. Our colleagues working in Indian country have talked with us about decolonizing the work of child welfare and restoring the values that guided tribes before settler colonialism. Similar to yesterday, we asked our panelists to have very open and frank conversations. Our panelists named this conversation Indian Country, support us, or get out of our way. Following this panel, we'll have a short break, and then we'll return for one additional panel with a further discussion about the road to abolition. Like yesterday, we'll take questions from the live stream chat occurring on both YouTube and Facebook. And as a technical note, closed captions and multi-language subtitles will be available after the virtual event has concluded. And we've provided information needed to turn on captions and subtitles in the comments section of both YouTube and Facebook events. And if you missed yesterday's events, both yesterday's event and today's event are available to watch at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work's YouTube channel and will soon be available at upinmovement.org. I'm excited now to turn over the stage to the moderator of our first panel and our moderator, Judge William Thorne. Judge Thorne has a very accomplished and extensive biography available in our program, but briefly I want to acknowledge that Judge Thorne has served for over 34 years as a tribal and state court judge. He's the former president and current vice president of the National Indian Justice Center and a former member of the board of directors for National CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates, and he's currently a member of the board of the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Judge Thorne, thank you for being with us today and for moderating this very important discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all. Too often, Indian country is, at best, an afterthought. So we appreciate being involved in this. To start off, I just want to do a very quick summary. Most of you are probably aware of Indian wars and so forth, but the first concerted effort at child welfare in this country dealing with Indians started with using Indian prisoners to educate them in the boarding schools. And the idea was it was cheaper to take Indians and educate them, take Indian children and educate them, rather than fight. So for 150 years, the explicit policy of the federal government has been removal as the solution to the so-called Indian problem. One commentator put it, boarding schools, child welfare are the Hiroshima of Indian families and communities. Well, supposedly that was remedied in 1978 with the passage of ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. But ICWA sets minimum federal standards for treatment of Indian children, not best practice. And even those standards are not honored. There has been resistance. Still today, nationally, Indian children are 3 to 4 times more likely to be removed than non-Indian children within the state child welfare systems. And some places are much worse. Minnesota, for example, Indian children are removed 21 times more often than other children. So clearly ICWA is not enough. So I've invited a team of what I consider to be superstars to join us, and thankfully they all said yes. But they pointed out to me that this is not about just reimagining, but about remembering how we used to do it in our communities and bringing those back, as well as incorporating the best things that others have to offer. So with me today are Abinanti, who is the first Indian woman to pass the California bar, first state court judge. I have Priscilla who has been the chair of social work schools, but has also concentrated on helping Indian communities figure out how to do better, both with fending off the system and with creating their own systems. And then I have Cheryl Fairbanks, who is probably the preeminent expert on peacemaking, which is an alternative decision-making, but more than that, solution-creating system. So I'm going to start off first with Abby. Abby, can you tell us what you do differently as Chief Judge at Yurok for Child Welfare Matters and why you do it?
Sure. For me, what I did is I looked at our system, meaning the tribal system, and I looked at the state system, and then I looked at who we were and what was happening to us, and devised an approach in each system that was different. You know, part of the problem with the Indian Child Welfare Act as a solution is that it's dealing with symptoms and it isn't dealing with context. And that's what you were trying to set out before, is that really social services as they're constituted in this country are part of maternal colonialism, because that system was set up by supposed feminists who then created a situation where they would take our children and save them from us, essentially, by educating them. And just coincidentally, they were educated to become servants in their homes and or laborers if they were male. So it's all part of sort of their economic interests is how these systems were set up. And one of the things that we're looking at is, okay, how is it working today? And it's not working. It's not working for basically anybody in these systems. And we looked at our system and I said, when we're dealing with people who have problems, there's essentially wellness issues. And those wellness issues came out of historical trauma. And we know what specific trauma we're talking about. And if you look at that specific trauma in our community, you can track behavior down to today. And so dealing with the symptoms as opposed to the context will not ever give you a complete answer or help the person go past that. So what we're doing is we're saying to people, look, you might get involved in the state system. And if you do, this is what we're going to do. If you're involved in the tribal system, then we're going to combine that system with an approach that puts your child in a guardianship and you in wellness. And there's not a time frame for this. Then, okay, you're X number of years old and now you have 6 months to fix it. It's like, wait a minute. No, it took me longer just to break any habit I have than 6 months, let me tell you. So you have to look at it and create something that is actually fitted to your situation. So if you combine guardianship with wellness, you can have services. And our wellness system is set up on 2-week reviews, so that if a person is in that system, they come into court with their worker and their advocate, and they have case plans that they work on with their advocate, whose main goal is to be their aunt or their uncle and help them progress toward their solution, all the while keeping contact with their child. And as that evolves, sometimes, you're looking at it and you come in and you're reviewing, because the guardianships we review every 6 months, but wellness court we review every 2 weeks, and so many times we'll have guardians call and say, oh, you know what? My daughter or my daughter-in-law now, she actually can take care of the kids. I've been having her live with me for a couple of months and she's doing much better now. And so you have that approach where the community makes a decision and the family makes a decision about their children, and so that's way different. And it doesn't make everybody have to go, okay, well, you've only got this amount of time to fix it. That doesn't work. And it isn't really helpful. And with that, you do things like go, okay, we're going to have groups. And those groups, we have the traditional AA in some of those groups, but most of our groups are around, we're going to teach you how to basket make. We're going to teach you how to do jewelry. For men, we're going to do nets. You're going to fish. And the system that is set up in social services is rights-based. We're not a rights-based culture. We're a responsibility-based culture. So it doesn't really help. It isn't my job to go and prove that you did something wrong. If you're doing something wrong, you are. So let's just fix it. How can we help you get to where you want to be with your family and your children? And how can you meet your responsibilities? You live in a community. You're responsible for taking fish, wood, whatever to old people. If you don't do it, it doesn't get done. And that's the kind of value system and then practices that we build up. And in working with the state system, then we look and we now have joint courts with the state. And the joint courts are wellness courts that our families can select to move into. And if they do, they're on 2-week reviews with their case plans. Much like our wellness courts. You still have the 6 months, 12 months, 18-month thing, but not the same. We will review it every 6 months because things need to be changed. So that's sort of what we're doing. Thank you.
So while we're waiting for Abby to come back online, there she is. Okay.
I think I've finished. It's for the next person. I'm not sure.
Priscilla, you may be frozen. Can you hear us? You've been training social workers.
Yes.
You've been training tribal workers. How are you doing it differently and why?
So I think Abby was talking about some of the why. So do we want to go back to Abby?
No, that's all right. You go ahead. You go ahead,
Okay.
Priscilla.
So thank you, Abby. So my name is Priscilla Day, and I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth in social work. And I also do a lot of state and national level work with tribal child welfare and family preservation specifically. I'm also a tribal member of the Leech Lake Reservation here in northern Minnesota. So I just want to send gratitude to the University of Houston. I really appreciate having the opportunity to have this much needed conversation, and thank all of you who are joining us today. I wanted to start with a fellow Minnesotan quote. Some of you know who Senator Paul Wellstone is. Unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash in 2002. But he was really a true progressive in the best sense of that word. And he said, a politics that is not sensitive to the concerns and circumstances of people's lives, a politics that does not speak to and include people, is an intellectually arrogant politics that deserves to fail. And I think if he were alive today, he would say this about the child welfare system. So it was really wonderful to hear the speakers yesterday. I think having people with the lived experience is so important. And what I want to say is in tribal communities, that looks a little different because we all have the lived experience. As part of our communities, as part of that legacy of colonization that Abby was talking about. And so we have been and continue to be impacted by colonized systems, including child welfare. And our communities still suffer with disproportionate negative impacts. I also want to say, and we may not talk a whole lot about this specifically, but we also have deep resilience and strength in our communities. There are really a lot of good things that happen in our communities, and I think we'll all share some examples of those. But our tribal ways are alive, and they continue to guide our lives so that we may live a good life. So when we talk about restoration, it's about bringing those more into the forefront, bringing those back, keeping those in the forefront, helping our people remember ways in which we helped our families to stay healthy. So I think Bill talked about, the disproportionality with Indian kids. Minnesota, as he mentioned, has the highest child welfare and native child welfare disproportionality in the country. And we've had that for many, many years. And so training is really important to train both new child welfare workers, but also workers that have been that have been in the system for a while. The other training we do is with tribes to really help tribes develop their own practice models that are based on their tribal ways of being and our tribal values. which see our families as relatives. And that's how many of our tribal child welfare systems are structured, as if we are working with our relatives, because we are. And so one of the things we were able to do in Minnesota, in large part because of advocacy with the tribes, on the part of tribes, is to start doing a 2-day ICWA training. And that training was vetted and approved by the tribes in Minnesota. And it contains the things they want child welfare workers to know when they're working with their families. And so, of course, it has information about the law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and Minnesota also has a Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act, a state ICWA law. But more importantly, or just as importantly, it also has information that really helps touch people at an emotional level so that they are able to understand in a visceral way why ICWA is important and how to do it in a way that isn't just in compliance with the law, but is also in the spirit of the law, which is family and cultural continuation. And so we started doing that in January of 2019, and we've now started doing that virtually. And it really does help to speak to people's
It looks like we've lost Priscilla's signal. Okay, you're back, Priscilla. Okay. Cheryl, one of the keys clearly is to get family, extended family, whole communities involved in finding solutions, not just making a decision, but finding solutions. Can you tell us how peacemaking can help with that process?
Yes, thank you, Judge. Thank you to the other panelists, and I especially enjoyed the opening remarks by the Dean. I'm Cheryl Fairbanks, and I'm Tlingit Tsimshian from Southeast Alaska, and I'm from a fishing family. And why I really like ICWA as the gold standard is we're able to involve our extended family and our community. And in Indian country, we still have a real intricate weave of our families and extended family. And we really feel like that's the best interest for our kids and all kids, to have that connection to family, extended family, and community. And after over 40 years of ICWA, there's still non-compliance. And we kept doing more of the same. And I know the Dean mentioned decolonization, and within our own communities, we really had to begin to look inward to just really see. We've been doing this since time immemorial. And we really need to bring our traditional values and our language and hold all the children up as if they were our grandchildren, where they get the best love and care. And in peacemaking, we say keeping the child at the heart of the circle. So it's really not a I win, you lose situation. It's keeping that child at the heart of the circle. A lot of what Abby said resonates so much, even though she didn't say peacemaking. It's really an indigenous process that is solution oriented and really is consensus building. And in that power of that circle, everyone has a chance to speak. And I noticed in some of our court systems, the grandmas and the aunties and the sisters, they're sitting outside the courtroom. And they're the ones that love the kids the most. And so in a peace circle, everyone has a chance to speak and their voice is heard. A lot of times we've been at the table, but our voice was not heard. And so echoing what Priscilla said, my husband is from White Earth up in Minnesota. And they have a real important, I think, shift in that they do not do termination of parental rights. They do a suspension, and they really protect the child, but they really have a way of bringing in extended family and community in a way that's healing and more therapeutic. And part of this, and I hope we'll get into it a little bit more, is really working government to government between the state and tribe, because there's been a real disconnect. And in that disconnect, the minute our kids hit the system, we lose them forever. And so there has to be some change.
You know, I think the things that, all three of the judges have talked about in terms of needing to heal from this history of colonization is something that we hear from our tribal child welfare workers all the time, that they have to go in and help families heal from that legacy of colonized child welfare practice. And they often go in with a gift, either some traditional medicines or maybe groceries or diapers or other things that family needs, as a way of showing that they are there to really help. And they really do want to help keep families together. And they really partner with their families. And there's one tribe in particular in Minnesota that actually changed their name from Children and Family Services to an Ojibwe name that means uplifting our relatives. And so they don't refer to clients anymore. They talk about a relative. I went to see a relative today. And that shifts the focus and the practice to one of something that I think most people go into child welfare to do, is to be compassionate and help families. But the system changes them into being about surveillance and compliance. And so, I think that public agencies can really learn from tribes is the way in which we approach the people who need help in our community.
There's another program called My Two Aunties. And your auntie is the person who puts their arm around you, feeds you, clothes you, has your back, but is not afraid to grab your ear and shake their finger in your face if that's what you need. But they're there to help. They're not there for a free pass, but they're there to help you in any way that you want. Abby.
I was just going to say it makes a huge difference, the way that the system is set up and the way that we're trained as social workers and lawyers is to be strangers. And doesn't work in our community, because that's not who we are. I mean, today, a man called me, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes before we started. He just got out of the hospital. He was shot the other night. He's a former client, and we've been to see him. And he was telling me different things, and I was responding. And at the end, he said, "That's what my mom said." I said, "Exactly. And you will do what she said, and you will do what I said." "Oh, okay." Because, that's why he called me, too. I said, "I care about you. I love you, and you need to stop this. Do you understand me? I need you to be safe." Yes. But he called me. We will go see him later today, but that's the point of it. It isn't about, I still have a case with him, because I don't, but I will go see him.
And can any of you imagine a system where the client, the family member, the parent calls the judge?
And I think we see that across Indian country in our tribal programs, including in our urban areas, that because of the different approach to working with the community, that the community comes to the agency or the court because they see you as a relative too, and as someone who can help.
I think too, what I liked is the word resiliency that was used. And all of us here on this panel have been through it. And so we know what works and what doesn't work. And I think that one of the areas is, especially for extended family.
Yeah, one of the things that we do in training, you know, and you know, again, that's kind of the area I was brought in to talk about was people in the United States, white people don't know the history of this country. They don't know the land they're on. Our universities don't understand that especially our land grant institutions who have big endowments, that those endowments came from the sale of native land. And so there's a lot of trying to get people to understand about the history of this country and the genocidal practices of this country that still impact our communities. And that I know can be uncomfortable, but it's also really important.
Abby?
I was going to say, you know, and it's also in the way they collect their data, like with ACEs. You know, I think ACEs is a good tool, but it's a late in the game tool. You know, it doesn't ask, did your grandmother go to boarding school? What was the impact of that? It doesn't ask. Here, one of our big problems was indentured slaves, and they would come and steal the children to make them basically laborers, like the boarding schools. You know, was somebody in your family involved in that? Were they a slave? And did they then run and come home, meaning that they weren't parented because they were slaves, and then they became parents, and now your parent was parented by somebody who was a slave, who didn't have parenting skills. You know, and that creates a context so that parent can also understand why is this happening? You know, because they wake up and feel mugged because they love their children. They just don't know how to make it work because the practices of it are so different. You know, you don't just wake up in the morning and you're a parent. You know, you learn that from watching and being parented. And if you're a slave, you don't get a lot of experience in that. You know, and so that we need cultural ACEs, you know, so you can tell where it came from, and then you can talk to the person and they can go, oh my God, you know, and then you don't feel so bad about, oh, I have to learn this and this is why. You know, it creates a context for you and it makes it more acceptable. It also explains it to the person.
Yeah, that's not about blaming them.
Yeah.
It's about helping them heal. Sure.
Judge, one of the things, getting back to extended family.
And that is what I hear from tribal workers who go out and work with families.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things with extended family and extended family and community is our kids are still being placed with non-Indian families today. It's not something that's happening, you know, historically. And what's happening is they don't belong. And so we have to really be careful about that initial placement, because now all those kids, whether they're aged out of foster care or in an adoptive situation, are trying to make their way home. Mm-hmm. And the tribes are trying to deal with that. And they don't belong in the Indian world or the non-Indian world. And they're in that area, that gray area, where, you know, high suicide rate, the dropping out of school, the drugs and alcohol, and a judge sometimes, or a system, is so quick to place a child, ignoring those placement factors, ignoring reunification, and then that child is suffering later on down, and when he becomes or she becomes an adolescent or an adult. And we have over 26,000 of our people in prison systems, and most of them have been through the foster care system. And so the system we currently have is still one of removal and not one of family reunification. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, well said.
So one of the things was trying to remember how we used to do it. As Abby likes to say, we were village people. We took care of each other. What should child welfare look like in Indian country?
I mean, I think it looks like extended family. That's what it looks like. Because it isn't that we didn't use or utilize extended family for support. We always did. And so that's what the system needs to look like, is extended family. And then part of what Cheryl was saying too was that now we need some special expertise with different issues, that we didn't have. And that's what the case manager can do, is bring that, the whole thing of like taking you down to the office and filling out your job application, those different kinds of things like that. That's what aunties do, or your uncle does, or whatever, I have a girl who's like, comes and cleans my house. And so in 2 weeks, she knows, one, before she starts cleaning the house, we will do her college applications. And then the next Tuesday, she will sit with the person that I have lined up with her to do her FAFSA, and her mom will be there too. And that's how it gets done.
Right.
You don't, and that's not a child that's necessarily in trouble at all, or isn't from an intact family. But I have those skill sets, and it's my responsibility to share them. And that's what it looks like. The system looks like sharing skill sets that you have and resources that you have.
It's about walking the path with them, not telling them to go down that road.
No.
And I think we have to spend more time on really prevention, because we're spending a lot of time on intervention, and the timelines within our child welfare systems are totally unreasonable to really have positive therapeutic change.
So,
And
one of the beliefs we have in many of our tribes are that our children are sacred, and in some of our tribes, we believe our children chose their parents. And that is a bond that cannot be broken. And even when children are removed, we see so often our children come back in search of their family. And so we really want to make sure that those bonds are not broken, so we don't have to, restore them. So I think tribes have really a lot to offer in terms of how to do child welfare differently, and to do it with community and in partnership with families.
Do these concepts translate to working with Indian families off the reservations, outside of Indian country, where they're in the urban settings? And I think I know the answer, but I'd like each of you to talk about that.
I would say definitely so. And a lot of our kids who end up in a state court proceeding where ICWA applies, have had this historical trauma, all the failed federal policies and state policies. And so we find them to be in the court system. But one of the things that we did here in Albuquerque is we established an ICWA court, an Indian Child Welfare Court. And we're really working hard at bringing tribal values and the tribal voice into that court. So we just don't move the docket and we keep doing more of the same. But we're so ingrained into systems, we're almost afraid to make the change and be bold about how do we effectuate change so our kids stay at the heart of the circle. And I know there's many courts like that throughout the country that are beginning to shift to more of a prevention instead of always an emergency intervention. And that really goes to healing and a therapeutic approach, so that we're building on our tribal values. And actually, when we worked with the non-Indian stakeholders within that court, and we actually did a peace circle with them, they were so receptive. I was kind of surprised, and they were very, very receptive of trying something different because they see the failure of the system. Thank you.
I would say too that one of the things that we're looking at in California is, in San Francisco, we've started a movement to create cultural districts and to start a village inside of San Francisco. And it'll be centered around Friendship House. and moving the Indian Health Center and the women's home into that arena so that we can create a village community, you know, and have communication back and forth and support that. And so I think we have to look toward different kinds of solutions and different ways to connect. I think the courts are a good one, but I also think having a community, and what I forget whether it was who mentioned it, but also working with the schools to talk about, let's teach a little truth here. You know, you all stole this and now you've messed it up royally, and we're happy to help you try to figure out how to fix it. But, you know, we have to have a little truth. And that's a big deal, you know, and that has to be put into the schools, and we can't be relegated to whatever.
You know, I can talk a little bit too about some other ways that we train, you know, really try to get workers to understand their own culture, in particular white workers, and and to think about their own history and what are the strengths and challenges that their family had. How did they end up in the United States? And to really look at their own trauma issues. I think there's a myth that only people of color and indigenous people have trauma, and that's not true. And if you don't know about that, it makes it hard to understand why that's important to pay attention to. And if you don't know your culture, then culture is not, you have a hard time understanding why it's important to other people. And so there's that personal work that I think we can offer when we're educating and training people to work in our communities, so that they have more empathy and more understanding about those issues.
I would just add in one thing is that when we're working in domestic violence and working with non-tribal members, we had them do the same exercise that I require the tribal people to do, which was find out when violence came into your family, because this is not something that is in most cultures. It was brought in. A lot of your ancestors came to this country on the run, away from abuse, away from whatever. And you need to know where it came in so you can understand how to push it out. You know, and that's how we start our work with domestic violence perpetrators. Figure out where it got into your family, how it got into your family, and let's figure out how to get it out of your family and for you to be the last in line.
One final thing. I'm going to ask each of you to take 1 minute. What lessons are here that non-Indians can apply to their own work and their own communities?
It looks like we're waiting for some of the audience questions to come up.
Well, what's the last word is, what lessons can be learned for non-Indians?
I think non-Indians can learn that we all share some universal values, that we can find some common ground on those values, like respect, like nurturing our children and respecting the elders. I have them right here, holding each other up, patience, speaking with care. And I think often we've been at the table and we shut down because, and listening is an important piece of this work. And so I think bringing our tribal values in and finding common ground in those values. Thank you.
I agree with everything that Cheryl said, and I don't really have much.
Thank you, Cheryl. I think that is so important. And, you know, I think tribes are,
it looks like Priscilla's
legislation and policies when they're put together. And I would just say, including the Families First legislation, that only tribes that are direct 40 tribes, and there's not that many, have access to those dollars unless they go through the state. And, you know, in some places, that's the state that has really high disproportionality, you know, and so they're always, you know, stuck in that place. So if we can learn how to work together using those values, that would be very helpful.
Okay, we have questions from the audience. Should be put up. It was also the bedrock of tribal sovereignty, and many times ICW workers focus on intergovernmental function. How does this challenge actual indigenous child welfare practices? So how do we respect tribal sovereignty and do good native child welfare practices? Abby, you have a working model of that in Northern California. How do you balance?
I think one of the ways that we've chosen to do it is by having MOUs with local social services, going out on calls together, having the joint court, and having both workers and all of our advocates, all of their advocates in the courtroom at the same time, setting up the plans. You know, if it's a partnership, then it's a partnership. And we come to an agreement and we provide as much help as both systems have available.
Priscilla, how do we get workers to recognize tribal sovereignty and still do work that they need with the family?
Yeah, so I mean, I think ICWA lays out the framework, right? So it talks about identifying, first of all, Indian kids. It talks about engagement with the tribe early on as a full partner. It talks about active efforts, and oftentimes tribes have resources counties or states don't have. And usually public child welfare workers are always surprised by that. So when you partner, like Abby said, you know, that can make a huge difference.
And does ICWA sometimes get in the way of actually doing work that needs to be done in the Native communities?
I don't know that it gets in the way so much as people look at it as if it was solving all the problems, and it really isn't, because it was a system designed to impact an imperfect system. You know, so by its very genesis, it's trying to impact a system that doesn't work. So you have to look beyond that and enlarge it, you know, or else you're going to get caught in that trap of looking at symptoms as opposed to context. And that is a trap in my mind.
I think too, having joint training and bringing meetings into Indian country, instead of having the tribes come into the city all the time, take the meetings out to Indian country and you'll see a big difference. Once you cross that reservation line, it's beautiful, and you'll see how the people take care of their families, their kids. And I noticed once we shifted some of the meetings into Indian country, it really made a big difference. And I echo what Judge Abby said in terms of MOUs. That's really an important sovereignty piece in terms of working government to government. And here in New Mexico, because of the joint trainings with all the stakeholders, we also have a state tribal judicial consortium.
The other thing I would just add is that ICWA has never been fully implemented, and people really don't understand.
Okay, Cheryl, did you
know, and that's problematic.
I just wanted to add that we have a state tribal judicial consortium where the state and tribal judges are working side by side. And so it's not the Indian problem, it's the Indian solution. And that's a big shift here. And if they're talking to each other, they're learning from each other, all children are winning. Thank you.
Okay. Next question. Waiting on the. Okay. How can we advocate for state child welfare systems to adopt policies mentioned in tribal communities, like eliminating termination of parental rights? That's referring to the customary adoption where kids are adopted, but they're not property, so you don't cut them off. It's not like a car where you have a bill of sale and you can only belong to one person. Kids belong to the whole community and to the extended family, and those families belong to them. So how do we get states to do this? I know California has that by state law. Abby, are you familiar with how you managed to get that to happen?
I think that the tribes have to advocate for it, and it's been very helpful here, because it leaves the families intact and it leaves the ability to have a relationship within the family. And it's worked really well for us.
Cheryl, how do you get states to adopt tribal values?
I think a lot goes back to joint training and working through these consortiums and making sure people are getting good information. Because here in New Mexico, we have a Keviness settlement agreement. And I asked some of the tribes if they understood it or they know what's going on with that. And often there's a big gap there in terms of misinformation. And so I think coming together, we're planning a summit, state tribal summit. And at that point, the leadership will be able to give their positions. And so I think a lot of grassroots work is done too between social workers, attorneys, judges, that often doesn't come from a formal meeting, but comes through sitting down and having coffee, and talking it out. And so the better we can get good information between the governments, our kids will win.
And Priscilla, you train workers in both systems. How do you get state child welfare systems to adopt tribal policies?
I think it's about conversation, but there also needs to be a willingness on the part of those systems to really listen and learn and adapt. And I think that's a real challenge. And it takes an enormous amount of ongoing effort and advocacy. And it's really hard to let go of a way of doing things, even when you're confronted with statistics that show it's not working. And so I just think it's a challenge, and I think conversations need to keep happening and advocacy on the part of the tribes.
Abby?
And I think at some point we actually have to challenge them and say, look, this is leftover. This is what implicit, explicit bias looks like. You've created it. And what side of the line in the sand do you want to be on? Because that's the truth of it. And sheltering them from their own ugly truth is not helpful either. It's just like dealing with anybody else. You can't cover it up for them.
Cheryl, last question. You're going to have about a minute. How do peace circles help families come up with their own solutions and prevent separation?
I think there's a lot of power in the circle, and individuals have a voice and they can contribute to the solution, so they actually own the solution. There's also a real spiritual, therapeutic thread that ties us all together, and it's like the weave of a basket. Very beautiful. Yet, like Judge Abby says, people are held accountable and responsible. And so through that circle, we can have a more therapeutic, healing solution, consensus model.
Right. And one of the values of the peacemaking is to listen and learn what the other people are thinking and feeling, not defend your own position. So once that's out there, then you see everybody's committed to the best interest of that child. And then what do I have to add to that? Because as Abby said at the beginning, it's a responsibility culture. It's not a rights culture. It's my right to say no. It's a responsibility. What do I have to add to the solution? So
And it's
that's
really Judge, it's really setting the sacred space so we can get clarity and a good solution. And one of the things that's the hardest thing is agreeing to disagree, but with respect. And when we agree to disagree with respect, we're getting more clarity and we're getting a better solution. Thank you.
last words. Abby?
Last word. Oh goodness. I guess it would be that I appreciate everyone who's watching and trying to learn and trying to look and say, you know, we sense that we need to do something differently, and I appreciate that. I'm sorry that we can't be in the same place and see each other because that helps me communicate. But I do appreciate the effort that you're making, and it was fun to see Cheryl and Priscilla, even on the screen. So thank you.
Okay. Sure. Or Priscilla, last word? Cheryl, last word.
Reciprocity. We can learn from each other with mutual respect.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Respect and understand that families are the best place for kids, not a system. So thank you all. Thank you for giving us the chance to join you. I want to thank the panelists and good luck.
Sure.
Thank you, Judge Thorne, and thank you to each of our panelists. I think we can all see that there's much to learn, much that state systems can learn from the practices that are being done in Indian country. So we really appreciate Judge Thorne and our panelists for. We're going to take a 10-minute break now, and then when we come back, we'll have our final panel that will be talking more about the road to abolition and what that looks like. So stay tuned, and right now, take a 10-minute break. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue now with our final panel, where we'll explore further the road to abolition. What does this look like, and how can we all be engaged in this work? And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel discussion, Leonard Burton, Senior Fellow with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, who will introduce our panelists. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for joining us on this momentous occasion. We're very happy to have everyone here, and I'm excited for the panel that we have gathered for you today. We have an esteemed panel of Kimm Campbell, Leon Caldwell, and Ned Breslin. I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves and take a couple of minutes to tell us about their work. This particular panel is designed to be a conversation. I'll ask a few general questions of all of the panelists about the work they're doing on the road to abolition, and a question or two that is specific to one panelist with follow-up from others. So first, let me ask my friend, Dr. Leon Caldwell, to introduce himself and talk about the work that he's involved in.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Leonard, thank you so much for the opportunity to share the work and actually be a part of the movement, which is really, I would say, as a liberation movement. And in some sense, the work that I've been doing over the past, several 20 some odd years has really been around liberating communities of color, particularly Black African-American communities, people of African descent, which actually encompasses a lot more than people think. But in that work, I've been really trying to constructively disrupt systems that don't serve us well. And in that constructive disruption, as both a scholar, activist, a researcher, and a practitioner, it's been in these various sectors that I've asked questions around, equity, more importantly, around what's the next step, if you will. One of the latest papers I wrote in 2019, January 2019, was released by the American Journal of Evaluation. Really is a kind of a capstone of a series of questions I ask in other sectors and other spaces, and really has hopefully pushed fields in disrupting the status quo of the way we do work. And that paper was titled, "Can Social Justice Live in the House of Structural Racism?" Mm-hmm. And that's a provocative question that goes across all sectors. And it requires us to really think, and my work has really been trying to push the thought on, are we aware of how indigenous in structural racism in some of our systems are? We continually operate some of these systems without the awareness of where policies and practices were first rooted. And then it requires us to ask a different set of questions as a result of that. So for those of us who have kind of bounced around the country and sometimes even globally around this issue of social justice, in order to have that first conversation, it's really an admission that the spaces we actually occupy are socially unjust already, or unjust, right? So let's start with that piece. And for the field, I want to, hopefully use that framing as a opportunity for introspection, an opportunity for really constructive disruption, and an opportunity to create the systems in which, and the functions of which, because there always have to be systems, the functions of which people can optimally live and have optimal health.
Awesome, thank you. No, thanks, Leon. I'll turn it over to Kimm Campbell. Kimm?
Hey everyone, great to be here. I'm Kimm Campbell, Assistant County Administrator in Broward County, Florida. And for those of y'all who don't know where we are, we're way down South Florida, about 20 miles north of Miami. We are a very diverse community down here with African American and white population, but also with Caribbean American and Latinx American communities, lots and lots of diversity within diversity in our community. And we realized for years now, like every other system, that we have disproportionality and disparate outcomes in all of the systems here in Broward County, and decided that as a local governmental entity, we really needed to do something about that. So in August of 2016, we started the Dismantling Racism Initiative. We created an Office of Equity and Community Investment, and under that umbrella brought anti-racism training to Broward County in partnership with the Children's Services Council of Broward County, the school board, and the Broward County Department of Health. So since 2016, we've trained over 3,000 people in an anti-racist analysis and established an infrastructure of support such that folks can continue deepening their analysis and building their relationships in the anti-racism work through caucus work and debrief sessions and book clubs, if you will, and just a continuing deepening of our understanding about what it means to work across social systems in the United States when such systems have racism embedded within them, intentionally or unintentionally, notwithstanding. And so, I'm happy to say that in terms of our public school district, they're a partner on board, and we've got 234 equity liaisons in each one of our schools down here, and we're the 6th largest school district in the country. The Broward Sheriff's Office, which is the largest law enforcement agency in our community, has agreed to have all 6,000 of their deputies trained in the anti-racism analysis. We've got a Ban the Box initiative going. We've got a civil citation program going to avoid arrests, and that's for both adults and juveniles, again, because every system has a disproportionality. We're just really rolling up our sleeves and doing the heavy work that is required to name racism as being what it is, take an honest look at ourselves within each of our systems and decide how we can systematically address the undermining practices that are supposed to help people, which are actually serving to continue to oppress them. Now, specific to child welfare, we started the race equity and child welfare work because we knew that Black families in Broward County were being just decimated, really, in 2 zip codes in particular, and we really wanted to do something about that. And so we started a pilot where we partnered with the community to have voice at the table, set guiding principles to guide our work, and we put all of the community partners through the anti-racism training so that everybody had the same analysis. And then we overlaid that on strengthening families as our approach to working with families of color. And I'm very happy to say that with the addition of the anti-racism lens within which we're doing this work, we've cut almost in half the number of Black kids we're bringing into care. So it's just incredible. I cannot tell you enough how important the anti-racism lens is. I've been a social worker for 25 years, and I've seen a lot of good work done with individual families and in some cases in neighborhoods, but I've never seen sort of deep and lasting change that really results in transformation such that the systems don't have to be intrusive in the communities that they're supposed to be serving and sort of are empowering to communities and families. And I really believe that this anti-racism approach to child welfare is the way to go. And if what that means is that we have to dismantle that system because those systems are not going to be able to step up to the plate to look at themselves and their racist practices and stop doing those things, then so be it. I feel like in Broward, we have enough leadership and synergy and momentum and the outcomes that maybe we can transform the system into being an anti-racist one, and it won't require a full dismantling. And that remains to be seen because it took generations to build this thing, and it'll take generations to completely abolish it. But I'm very, very optimistic about the numbers and the results that we've had using this anti-racism lens. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kimm. And last but not least, my new friend, Ned Breslin. Ned. Just 1 second, Ned, you're still muted.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
I think everyone in the country is going to know what Broward County is in the coming weeks because every electoral map will zoom in on Southern Florida. So Kimm, you will not feel so alone in a couple of weeks. Real honor to be here. Amazing panel. The meetings we've had beforehand have been really profound. And I'm excited for this conversation. My name is Ned Breslin. I'm the president and CEO of the Tennyson Center for Children in Denver, Colorado. I have the power, I will tell you, over the last couple of days, the power of the voices of moms in particular who are fighting for their kids has hit me very hard, but from a slightly different angle. And I just want to say, I come to this conversation coming from a family that I actually needed to be removed from. I grew up in a family of extreme physical, sexual, and emotional violence. And so I did need to be protected. So I'm not an abolitionist in the sense that people talk about it here. I am more of a kind of systems change person, and we're trying to do something at Tennyson to change the system. It hurt me listening to these moms in particular and their powerful stories, and the other moms that I know, because truth be told, I'm 55 years old, and every year on my birthday, I do wonder if my mom will call, and she never does. And so that pain, which the previous panel was talking about, is real. And so my healing journey has been profound. I've integrated a lot, but I still carry sadness and sorrow. What we're doing at Tennyson is a little bit, I'm going to play a little bit off what Kimm said, is we're testing something to see if we can get to a different place. And it's not certain we will, but we're going to give it a shot. So what Tennyson is doing, and we're, just for quick background, we're a pretty standard residential community-based day treatment program. We're late stage. When I joined 3 years ago, we were considered pretty late stage actors. So kids would be bouncing through the system 10 to 15 placements before they got to us. And when I applied for the job, I basically said, can you imagine Tennyson playing a fundamentally different role in this? Because this isn't working. It's not working for the kids who come through Tennyson. It's not working for brothers and sisters who have journeyed through child welfare and are disproportionately homeless, unemployed, undereducated, and all of that, which we all know. So can you imagine a different world? What that requires, if you're going to do systems change right, and I can talk about what we're actually doing, but if you're going to do systems change work right, you have to do two things, and this is where I want to play off what Kimm's saying, is the first thing you have to do is look at yourself. And you have to ask really hard questions about how are you contributing to the problems, and how are you contributing, well-intentioned, not well, whatever it is, how is your existence helping children heal and undermining healing journeys? And you have to ask really hard questions of yourself, because you cannot be a credible change agent or systems change provocateur if you don't walk the walk. And so Tennyson has had to go through some really hard work on what our contribution to the problems are, because the truth is that Tennyson children, for all the successes that we can talk about, kids who've come through Tennyson are on the street, they are incarcerated, they are unemployed, and that's not acceptable. And we're part of that problem. So we have to change ourselves. We also have built an initiative called Rewiring, which is using philanthropic dollars and Tennyson operating in a different way to ask a question that has come up over and over in this amazing conference. And that is, what the sector does is buy bad outcomes with services, the way money moves, the way the system is set up, the racism of the system. All of that is buying bad outcomes, and it's driving decisions towards those bad outcomes. So what if we change the question? So what Tennyson is doing is saying, if you were liberated from funding decisions, and if you were liberating from the narrow band of approved evidence-based practices, which I will tell you, I've never met a family that says, I need MST. It's just not what most families need. So if you liberate, to use Dr. Caldwell's word, if you liberate the funding landscape and we're held to a different outcome, and that is a dramatic reduction in the number of children and families who become child welfare involved, because you keep families together, because you dramatically reduce police contacts, because you dramatically reduce hospitalizations, because you build up mandatory supporters as opposed to mandatory reporters. How would you invest? And after about 1.5 years, this work has done a lot of things that the people in this community, this amazing upend community, are talking about. And after 1.5 years, it's still early days, but not one family across 10 counties in Colorado that we're working in, not one family has become child welfare involved because we've acted differently. And the departments of human services, who are our partners, are making radically different funding decisions to not do preventative services, but to truly strengthen families and build those foundations so that they never come across the child welfare portal. And so I'm excited to talk about it. There are real opportunities with the work that we're doing, and there are enormous risks of trying to change a system within the system, and we're walking into that with eyes wide open. So, Leonard, I'm so grateful to be here.
Yeah, Ned, thank you, and grateful that you joined us. And we'll come back to, because I want to hear some of your story, your international story, the work you've done internationally in Mozambique. Leon has done international work as well. But I want to say to the audience here, you've heard my comrades in struggle around abolition. Be not dismayed. We intentionally brought diverse voices to the table in this movement because people start at different places in a movement. And our goal is to get everybody on board on this road to abolition. And so this is what this panel is going to talk about. This is what this panel is about, is what work they're doing on this road to abolition. So thank each and every one of you for this work. So I want to jump in on this. I said I was going to ask a general question, but Ned, I want to feed off of a statement you made and pitch it over to Leon real quickly. And it was around this whole notion of evidence. So Leon, how does our conceptualization of what we call good evidence affect our ability to understand and weigh the voices of people with lived experience in these systems?
That's a big question. It's a good question. It's a big one. So, I mean, we know, if you look at just the methodologies that are traditionally used in the evaluation space and the research space, we know that some of these methods are, they are in line with some of the structures that exclude people's voice behind data, right? And particularly big data. And we know it's a huge problem because there's there's methodological issues. And we can say data is data, but where data becomes live, where people's information becomes live, is in the interpretation of that data, right? And what typically happens is the folks who are studying these issues or challenges and even building systems, policies, and practices are usually not that close to the people where data are collected, right? So the contextual factors of data rarely miss the interpretation, right? So one's observation, which is really what data is an observation of a behavior or one's kind of perception of or experience of a particular phenomena. Like that experience then gets colored by one's cultural nuance. And the minute you add language to it, you actually introduce bias. And we're not honest about that as researchers. Like we typically try to play in this space where this is objective observer and this unbiased filter. That's not true. The minute you add English to it and put particular words and meanings, you actually introduce bias. So the issue is that we need to be clear about what our biases are. And oftentimes those biases are loaded with race, gender, sexism, whatever those are. And in those loadings, we typically come up with interpretations of one's voice that's external to us, that we've objectively observed, quote unquote, objectively observed. And now we objectify that quote unquote sample, right? Or members of that sample. And in that objectification, we walk away from it with some bit of arrogance about whose interpretation of a particular number is right or wrong. And unfortunately, in the evaluation space, what's not often talked about is, you know, the history and systems of the very sectors or systems in which we're playing in. Mm-hmm. For example, the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, actually policing in general, right? Until I think this year, most people didn't realize that policing was actually out of control of Black bodies in the South. Like this, you know, you think about the color of law and some of the other slavery by another name. You actually really understood what policing was, right? And what it's morphed into now, what most police don't even understand. They talk about systems, they talk about property control and things of that nature. So you have to ask the same question around child welfare systems. What was it, right? And what was it intended to do? And what ways was it intended to do that, right? And then you overlay that. If you don't know those basic things, then your interpretation of people within the system and the data that they actually provide you knowingly and unknowingly, right? And sometimes not even data questions you asking them, it's basically data that is in these big systems, these big data captures, and they're really conjectures, right? But they are put out by, I think, well-intentioned in many cases, researchers who actually they drink their own Kool-Aid in terms of the supremacy of their knowledge base, right? And their ability to interpret data on subjects where they have very little context, or they're using other forms of data to give context. Now, my voice out of context, this is why text messaging is different. How many of you have had text messages totally gone awry because somebody read into it something you didn't actually write or have intention to it? I always use this example because it is real. Like, we don't, you know, of course, you know, research is going to tell you, well, we're using different coefficients to do this, or we're using a Chromebook alpha to look at these things, or the cells are telling us this, and we're triangulating this data, that data. But it's still void of, and even in the qualitative space, it's still void of voice. And very few of those researchers actually go back to those systems or create mixed methods to confirm or disconfirm their interpretation. Yeah. And the systems are built on interpretations of well-meaning folks. And just, you know, to be quite frank, most of them are not people of color. And most of them have not lived in some of the lived experiences, the data sets, or even the populations they're making huge even conjectures about.
Yeah, it certainly causes more harm to those communities, right? And so that's why we fundamentally have to dismantle everything about this child welfare industrial complex. See, I'm less concerned about people names in marquees and whose name, who's the first author on a journal, on a refereed journal. I'm less concerned. I'm not even less concerned about it. I really don't care about it, right? But what I do care about are the Black families and communities that are being harmed while people are making money off the backs of their experiments, and that's what it becomes. Right? So I want to get Kimm in here because Kimm, you received some data. Knowledge, you received some data, and you're a data-driven decision maker. I know that about you. But sometimes data is hidden from leaders or given to leaders in a way that folk want to lead them in a certain direction. Can you talk about how you've seen data used to support what needs to happen for families, and how data has been used to continue to hurt families?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can tell you that it was the data that spurred the movement in Broward County. And we're set up a little bit differently in that we're a mix of public and private partnership in child welfare. So the sheriff's office is responsible for investigations. The county has an office to do forensic evaluations that inform the decisions that get made as part of the investigative process. And then the state has contracted with nonprofits to serve as lead agencies to manage case management, and foster care. So it's sort of a three-pronged stool. And our local nonprofit lead agency was having fiscal challenges several years in a row, and the state convened a huge meeting with all of us in the room to talk about how the community was going to come together to address the issues of the lead agency. And they had a bunch of data for us about the number of kids we're serving and how many investigations and how many coming into care and how long they stay in care and all the typical metrics that you see in a child welfare system. But somebody let me know that one of the slides that was removed from the presentation was one that showed the disproportionality in Broward. And it just was infuriating. Like, I couldn't understand it. I got my hands on the slide, and I met with Jermaine Smith-Ball, who is the CEO of the Urban League. And you don't typically think about an urban league as being a child welfare partner, but what I realized was that in order to move the dime in regard to removals, we needed to bring in an influential leader in the community who is seen as somebody who speaks on behalf of and is the voice of people of color in Broward. And so we worked together to bring her up to speed on what child welfare is and what it looks like in Broward County. And together we built the Race, Equity, and Child Welfare Task Force. And, it's been going now for, I guess, 3 years. And we're just seeing phenomenal results. Everybody is at the table, and I'm not saying that it isn't without its challenges, and people are in differing places in their analysis of what it means to be anti-racist and what it means to work in a racist system. And so there have been growing pains, and people have dropped off and come back on. But the reality is that everything we do is couched in data. We have to keep our eyes on the numbers, and we have to, be concerned about how many kids are coming into care, how long they're staying in care, what they get while they're in care, why white kids aren't coming in when black kids are, and the black kids have lower risk than the white kids. I mean, there's so many questions and so many implications, and we have the data because we're using metrics to collect it, and we say we're using that to inform our decisions. But if you up-level your thinking such that as a decision maker, you're using the aggregate data to make those decisions, then you have to pay attention to the disproportionality and the disparate outcomes. Broward isn't any different than any other child welfare system in terms of the length of stay once you enter the system being at least twice as long for black kids as white kids, and so I mean, in this one example of how race, equity, and child welfare in Broward County got started, it's an example of how they didn't use the data correctly and how we then took it and did something with it that really is resulting in transformational change for kids and families. We created this task force, facilitated an RFP process to bring a new provider to the table to serve the kids in these particular zip codes that were being decimated. And so this is a small nonprofit. It's called Community-Based Connections, and they are an African-American nonprofit serving primarily African-American kids and families. They're situated right in the zip code where these families live. There's already an element of trust and relationship between this provider and the community because they serve people that live there, whether they're actual clients where they get reimbursed for services or not. Mm-hmm. We had family members who participated in the child welfare system serve on the RFP selection committee that selected this provider, so the families got to have a hand in the decision making about where the money was going to go, and that's the right way to do it. And so following on the heels of this pilot, we decided at the Broward County Human Services Department to move $86 million from the procurement department over to the Office of Equity and Community Investment so that we can release funds in our systems of care through an anti-racism lens. So we're really trying to put our money where our mouth is, using the data to drive us and to check us. And we stand on our guiding principles that what is required is to be anti-racist. There just isn't another option.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Caldwell, I know you wanted to jump in, and then I'm going to come your way after Dr. Caldwell comments on this. So be prepared, all right? Just hold on.
Yes.
Hey, Dr. Caldwell, here, you talked about this, your American Journal, you talked about the article you published in the American Journal of Evaluation. And I know you're going, I want to feed this as a part of you answering this question, the other part of the question. Also, discuss the point that you made that evaluators may not be racist, but how they work might support racism.
Yes. So, and this goes into the I think the bigger issue of like understanding that many times people are operating in systems where they don't understand the history of those systems or the use of those systems. So we typically just go into practice by whether it's methodology or data collection strategies or whatever. And we don't ask the question of, well, how is this data being used? We don't ask questions of who's excluded from the data. We really don't, there's a lot of questions we just don't ask. I think Kimm's example in Broward County is a good one of really how data is even presented and what's the value of data. I mean, let's be clear, there is a research industrial complex. There's a lot of people making a lot of money from systems to do evaluation, collect data, build data systems, things of that nature. I don't actually believe data itself is harmful. I believe the way we use data can be harmful. And that means that how we're interpreting the data, because data can actually, I talk about data is either, a weapon of mass destruction or a tool for liberation, right? So in some ways that mass destructive piece we've seen in the Monahan report, we've seen that in the data that was used for quote unquote super predator research that was all kind of bogus and how it was active, method and everything else was used. We've seen it and to really justify incarceration of Black and brown kids because of mental health issues, quote unquote. We've seen data used in mass destruction of people, right, and communities. But it also offers liberation, like a way to say if it's used differently, to your earlier point, and if we disrupt the way we actually use it and be more inclusive in how it's actually used, it really can be a liberating tool to say, the 20 years we've been doing this, it's not worked, right? We have good data to show through trend lines and things of that nature that it hasn't worked. And then there's ways in which, and even people we've been paying for the past X amount of years to do literally the same thing with no real true results except outcome data or output data, but not real outcome or impact data, right? Or anything that says lives have changed. At the end of the day, if we are really about the work, I think that Kimm and Ned and yourself is about, we should be able as service providers to see not an increase in number, because most times populations haven't increased, but actually a decrease in number because our services are so good that there's an attrition, right? That's real empowerment. Like that's real liberating work. If your data shows you not that your numbers have increased because more kids are on the system, but the families you've actually dealt with, actually, as some are entering, some are actually leaving. And we don't see that. We don't see that kind of data. I don't even know who's publishing that kind of data, right? Because there's something that's being reinforced in the systems. And this goes back to the paper. There's something that's being reinforced by having data that shows the need, right? The more we show the need, the more money we throw at. And nobody's asked, well, if what we threw at, shouldn't it be decreasing the need? And this is where Ned's work comes in. Right. This is like the kind of questions Ned's asking of his system, right? Like we shouldn't be having, it's not a whole bunch more kids in the system, right? Or in the population hasn't grown tremendously for that number. So where are we getting these kids from? And why are we not seeing the same families who have been in the system actually doing better? And that's the point, Leonard, I actually want to say is that, while data is, we want to be careful about how we talk about data because it actually can be a tool of liberation. It can be a tool for change, right?
If used right.
But it's how we actually, data allows us to ask certain questions and how we frame those questions with data is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
Because the framing of those questions at the beginning actually gives the answers that, it frames how we actually do the answer. So I think in this conversation in this, abolition movement, like data can be very important. but we have to ask the right questions. We have to have inclusive ways of interpreting data, and we can't go to the usual suspects that's been perpetuating the system. And that system, in some cases, as you all have said and been working in for a long time, is basically a racist system. There's some pieces of that system that's built in structural racism. And if we can acknowledge that and then say, you know, let's start doing something different, and let's look at how we're using the data to perpetuate the system, the racist system, then as a practitioner, as a researcher in that system, I need to acknowledge that while I may not be racist per se, interpersonally, I am operating to perpetuate a structurally racist system.
That's right. Yep. So thanks, Leon. And so I want to toss it over to Ned. And Ned, this is great in terms of the data and how you've used data and the financing, some of the creative financing that you've done at Tennyson Center. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is so rich, and I'm so grateful. So I think it's absolutely right, and I'm going to give you a concrete example of how using data and then looking at it from a different lens gave you a different picture and led to different responses. So remember when I said that we're going to try to buy different outcomes? I think the one reason the sector struggles is what we're not doing is buying outcomes. We're not using data to drive decision making. What we're buying are services. And so I will tell you at Tennyson, where we have evidence-based practices, really good, our staff rock and everything, we started asking 3 years ago, what is the impact of that work? I can show you all day that we did the services. I can count beds and numbers of kids and show you pictures and all that. Well, I can't show you pictures, but you know what I mean. And the truth is, you're asking me the wrong question. You're not asking me the right question. The question should be, if we are working with a family, are they stronger? Are they safer? Are they at less harm from police contact? Are they at less harm from constant child welfare engagement? And if they are not, you should not be working with us. That is a different way to look at it. Mm-hmm. We also did Tennyson has a residential program, and we are really looking at recreating it. And we could talk about that another time. But when I got here, I was startled by the restraints. And so we have embarked on a journey over the last 3 years to reduce restraints. And shame on me, but this is a perfect example of what you're talking about. We were looking at dramatic reductions in restraints, and then we finally looked at it through a racial lens, which is what Kimm and Dr. Caldwell are talking about. And we found out that we're actually restraining children of color for 2 minutes longer than white children. And so that says something. That is using data and saying, wait a minute, what is going on there? And so we not only need to solve that problem, but and that is being done because that is unacceptable. We also have to ask ourselves as an organization, how is that possible? How has that world been able to operate within an organization like Tennyson that really does care for kids and really has great people and all that kind of stuff? So to Dr. Caldwell's point and to Kimm's point is, we had data that was showing us one thing. We put a different lens on it and it showed us something else. And the truth is, we're going to get better, and we're going to have to wrestle with the racial implications of that within our organization. And if we're going to be a systems change organization, then we have to go there. We have to go there, and we have to ask those hard questions. So to Dr. Caldwell's point, it's a really good example of using data to improve by asking the right hard questions. And I got a lot of examples of that, but I just wanted to put that on the table because it's a concrete example of how to pivot and trying to move. And we are trying to move from a service-based financial model to an outcome-based financial model where money goes to the outcome, not to the service.
Thank you. No, thank you, Ned. And so I know Kimm is ready to jump in. And I'll say thank you, Ned, for being transparent on the data and what you found. You talked about, African-American kids were being restrained 2 minutes longer. And as an abolitionist, I'm going to say, don't restrain any kids, right? All right, we stop, stop hog tying, stop putting your foot on their necks, let them breathe, right? That's what needs to happen. And when the systems are designed to allow those type of practices, that's where we have to be vigilant in saying enough is enough. Now is the time. Let's stop it, right? And so I know you're committed to that, Ned, but I just wanted, the audience to know, that that's where we are, and that's how we're going to dismantle these systems. So we talk about, one of the ways when we talk about upend, we want to call out racist policies, practice, and research, right? Those are the three things we want to call out. And we then need to identify anti-racist policy, practice, and research that helps families and communities be whole. And Leon, you mentioned the Moynihan report. It's one of the reports that I keep in my crosshairs, right? For some, it's a famous report. For many, like me and abolitionists, it's an infamous report. The Moynihan report essentially said that the Black community was pathological and pathogenic, that there were no strengths in the Black community. Well, I operate from, and many of us and abolitionists operate from the adaptive vitality school of thought, right? Saying that we're resilient, that we have strengths, and that because in spite of the socioeconomic harnesses and roadblocks that Black people have had to jump through and endure, we're still strong and we're still standing. Thus, there is value in Black people. And so that's part of what we need to hold true to in these systems. And the child welfare system in this country, I would submit to you all, is all the policy, practice, and research are predicated on that 55-year-old report. When you think about the policy, practices, and research in child welfare over the last 55 years, the way the systems are designed are predicated on that report, that the Black community is pathological and pathogenic, and it needs saving, and somebody needs to come in and save it. And so you start snatching children from communities. And when you snatch children from community, you leave voids in communities. I know I'm not supposed to be talking, y'all supposed to be talking, but I'm passionate about this. Kimm, go ahead. I know you want to say something.
Oh, well, what I was going to say is a nod to Ned as a service provider who is advocating for a shift from funders, which is what I am, to invest in outcomes rather than outputs or services, right? So Ned's probably the only CEO in the country of a nonprofit agency that's saying that. Right. But he's actually accurate, and so there are some systems that do a combination of performance-based contracting and service-based, unit of service contracting. In Broward, at the Human Services Department, we are still unit of service. However, we have built performance evaluation outcomes into our contracts, and we're slowly moving the community system of care to a performance-based contracting modality. Mm-hmm. They are not in favor of it. Obviously, it's easier to just count the number of kids and sessions you have and get reimbursed from that rather than have your money be tied to actual impact in kids and families' homes. But that is definitely where, in rebuilding a child well-being system, that funders like governmental entities where I work should consider a redesign.
Thank you. Ned, the Mozambique work, you spent time in Mozambique with your family. You're doing some great work. Talk about some of the work you did in Mozambique. The lessons that you learned in Mozambique around radical transformation, and how it's informed the work you're doing here, and then also talk about the families, how families and communities supported each other, and what lessons can we learn from what you saw in Mozambique?
I so appreciate that question. The panel before us was very similar to what I saw in Southern Africa. I was in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. What we saw is that you can actually invest in families and communities in non-traditional ways and get outcomes by allowing families and communities to use their strengths and their ability to see each other and their ability to lean in different ways that does not require government intervention. And so what we saw, one of the things we talked about on one of the earlier calls, Leonard, that I thought was so exciting is we did cash transfer programs, for example, to communities that around. I'm a water and sanitation guy before this. And, people thought we were nuts. We were transferring $20, $30, $40, $50,000 to these rural communities that, everyone's like, they're illiterate, they don't know this, they don't know that. We did 3,200 investments, 3 corruption challenges, 1 was real. And the rest of them used their money to change their lives, and they controlled their destiny. So my favorite days were when construction companies who were putting in water projects would call me up and they would say, the community just fired me, like, you need to intervene. And I'm like, no, you didn't do good enough work for them. You work for them, and they are rejecting you. And that was pretty transformative. And so we're seeing some of that in rewiring. The power of rewiring is to be able to make investments in totally unconventional ways that are asking the question of how do you radically reduce the number of children, families coming into child welfare? And what are they investing in? They're investing in communities in different ways. They're investing in housing. They're investing in basic supports. They are investing in ways that create that foundation that I will tell you the first thing that's going to happen in rewiring is going to be this neglect thing is going to go, is what's being attacked, because we know it is a incorrect word for community. And we know that a lot of the kids who end up at Tennyson started on their journey because they had a phenomenal mother who had to make a horrible choice between 2 jobs and keeping her kids safe and all of those kinds of things. That is ridiculous. That is where the moms and everybody who's saying that should never happen are exactly right. So I learned in Africa that if you trust communities, if you see them as strong as opposed to see them as problems, don't identify individual families like your family's a problem and your family's a problem, but you sit back and say, how do we collectively operate to change the way that the outcomes of this area, it happens. That is what I learned. And that's what rewiring is showing in partnership with departments of human services and other role players who are basically saying, let's seed and invest in truly strengthening families on their terms. And let's make the outcome that we never see them again.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. Yeah, thank you. My heart was warming as you were talking about that. Having spent time in South Africa during apartheid and walking through those villages, while things were happening, there was so much richness and value in the people, and we can't discount the value. Even around with the calamity that we see around. And the calamity that we see around in these communities is not that the people have created the calamity, it's that the systems and the structures that they live in have created those calamities. The divestment in places like Detroit and Philadelphia and other places, in certain neighborhoods, right? In Baltimore, in certain neighborhoods where these divestments have happened. And then you see what folk will call blight, then leads to gentrification. That's another conversation.
We still, just real quickly, we still don't want to have the conversation about what's really happening in Flint. But let's be honest. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is exactly right. If you believe in communities, and if you believe in families, and if you believe that people can lean in different ways, and mandatory supporters as opposed to mandatory reporters, you can change the world.
Yeah. Thank you, brother. Leon, let me let you make one last statement, then we're going to pivot to the audience have several questions for you all. So let me let you make this last statement before we pivot to the audience questions.
So I just wanted to say this, Ned brought up just the work in Africa, different parts of the continent. There's a saying that we in the United States get totally wrong on a regular basis, and we use it as a slogan. So we say it takes a village to raise a child, right? That's actually not the accurate saying. The interpretation is it takes a whole village to raise a child, and whole meaning healthy. And when we start talking about what a healthy village is, then you bring in some of these other conversations about other systems, whether it's transportation, water, food quality, housing. And those are the Ned's saying, these are not the conversations that we want to have. And it's ironic that Kimm would even in her statement say, you wouldn't think of an urban league being a partner with a child welfare system. Why wouldn't it be? It's about jobs, right? Like it should be a natural partner. So if we start thinking about these, and I used to say this to folks when they bring up that it takes a village to raise a child. If you don't put the whole part of it, then you can say it takes a village of idiots to raise a child, right? Like if the village idiots are raised, what are you going to get, right? So you have to qualify who the village is and the health of the village. And that's just really important. And that's all.
No, thank you so much. That's a fundamental difference. And that's something that people need to etch in their consciousness, in their hearts, how to make people whole. And you often hear the saying, hurt people, but we also know that healed people heal people. And it takes some healing of the work that we do in our own spaces to talk about healing community and individuals. I want to turn it over to the audience and get some questions in. What do we have, Rania? First question from Kristen Clark. If neglect is 80% of child welfare calls, how do we build resources and community support to stop removals for neglect? It seems redistributing funding to support families rather than giving. Who wants to take this? Giving it to foster parents. Yeah. Go ahead, Ned. You're muted.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, I so love that question. The whole premise of rewiring is we're going to buy different outcomes with philanthropic dollars. We're going to show how money moves differently, and then we're going to rewire, convert the way public funds are spent. Because what Kristen is saying is exactly right. There is nothing in the existing public funding system that supports what she's talking about. But if rewiring works and it liberates, again, going back to Dr. Caldwell's word, if it liberates funding to get that outcome, then you're shifting the way the sector is financed and you're forcing different actions because you're going to get better results. So what should happen is less funding for residential facilities and places like that, more funding for family support so that they do not need to come to residential. They do not need to come into the system. And once you do that, you will find not only is it cheaper, but it is more impactful. The Joint Budget Committee in Colorado did an initial model of the work that we're doing. We're looking at a $1.2 billion spend in child welfare, and they reckon you will get better results for $175 to $250 million less than you're spending now by doing exactly what Kristen is talking about.
Wow. Thanks, Ned. Thank you so much. Anyone else want to answer? Take a shot at that? Kimm? Or we can move
Well, the only thing I would add to that is that when you redirect resources to invest in communities, you have to remember that unless you're simultaneously doing anti-racism work, then those services are still being delivered within a racist structure. And so, yes, redeploy resources so that they can be used to help communities and families preserve themselves. However, we have to dismantle the racist structures within which the services and supports are accessed and delivered.
Absolutely, yeah, and we can't just continue to rely on the usual vendors and suspects in our communities.
Correct.
So for that, I'm about to put in just a quick plug. There is a Youth Thrive survey on resources, community resources. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues from the Youth Thrive team to put the link on Facebook Live and YouTube and ask people, because we want to find those rich resources, those mom and pop shops, right? Those community-based resources that never get the attention of child welfare. They don't have access to the RFPs. Sometimes their back office isn't as strong as we require them to be. Well, that means that the folk with the money, these government entities with the money, need to invest in shoring up the capacity of these community-based resources or organizations, because that's where the community goes. They go to the places that they know and trust, not necessarily the places that are able to rent a building and plop some staff in the community.
Correct.
Yeah, there's a I think there was a move several years ago around really looking at these informal systems.
Mm-hmm.
And we do know that, for some people of color, just culturally, these informal systems are systems in which, to Leonard's point, they trust. I did my dissertation actually was on cultural mistrust of mental health systems, and we just found that the preference was actually not to go to a psychologist in a mental health setting. They would rather go to pastors or some other kind of indigenous helper, if you will. And those indigenous helpers weren't always the best. Let's be true, right? But that's just where they felt that they should go. So I think the point I think Kimm is saying, and Ned as well, is part of the funding stream could be in supporting both the capacity and the scaling of those systems which people culturally and indigenously actually want to use, right?
That's right.
If you force me to go into a clinical office, for my 50-minute session because that's the only thing you're paying for, then I'm actually going to show up. But is it the best system for me, where I'd rather be outside in nature, having a walk on the lake, or walk around the lake having therapy, or having my friends and family be with me because they're part of my kind of system, my own spirit system. They can help me navigate things, and even thinking about his individual therapy for people who are generally collective or communal. Does that really make sense?
Right.
So it's just ways in which we gotta, this whole rewire, if you will, rethink, reimagine. And I think Kimm's call for dismantling or eradication of things that don't serve us well. And we know they don't serve us well because we actually do have data that shows they don't. And that's the part where, going back to the boldness of this abolition movement, or the movement itself, to really disrupt and constructively disrupt, because there are families who have needs, right? And I think the sentence is there's multiple ways to get your needs met. And one way is to have a system that meets it that ain't racist. And another way of saying it, there's a system, or maybe it's not a system. Maybe there's some people who function in your life who are not racist, who understand you. And that could be, by the way, I'm not saying it's all going to be all, Black people need to all see Black people. And also there are people who are just humanists, right? That can actually, help and support families. And support, and that's the big word, not just see people as needy.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. Next question, Lori. Ms. Campbell mentioned the Sheriff's Department conducts investigations in her county.
Mm-hmm.
This leads me to consider the intersection of law enforcement and child welfare. It seems that this intersection complicates efforts to shift from a surveillance compliance-based system, when law enforcement is largely based in surveillance compliance activities as part of their role. How can this be addressed?
So I'll say a couple things. I'll say that the child welfare system in and of itself is a surveillance system, and it doesn't matter if it's done by a private nonprofit, a state or county governmental entity, or the sheriff's office. Doesn't matter. The system is designed to surveil communities, and unfortunately, they over-surveil Black communities. So that's the first thing. In Broward County, while the investigations are situated in the Sheriff's Department, it's not actual sheriff's deputies that do the investigations. It's social workers and other bachelor's degree human services professionals. What's challenging about that, based on direct conversations with the staff that are responsible for doing that work, is that they are situated in a culture that is law enforcement, and the culture of law enforcement is different from the culture of social work. That's just the bottom line. And so there's a tension there always. It's just inescapable. There's 67 counties in Broward, in Florida, and Broward is one of 3 counties that have it set up that investigations happen in a sheriff's department. It's statutorily written that way. for our communities. And so what it'll take in Broward in terms of overcoming that is to have a change in statute to move that book of business away from the sheriff's office. So in the meantime, what we're doing is partnering with them to become an anti-racist organization. Now that is a mouthful because we're talking about law enforcement, right? Right. So we started the partnership with BSO in the anti-racism work in the child welfare investigation unit with the civilians who do the investigations. It is the new sheriff, Sheriff Gregory Toney, who has signed on to expand that initiative across his entire department so that detention, law enforcement, dispatch, all of them get access to the anti-racism analysis. And we'll see where it goes. You know, we're at the very beginning of this partnership with the entire BSO office, but we're very hopeful under the leadership of Sheriff Toney that we're going to see some dramatic improvement in terms of relationships between law enforcement and our community members and what it looks like to deliver services, policing and otherwise, in a different way using an anti-racist lens.
Thanks, Kimm. Thanks.
I almost don't know how the word policing and anti-racism actually is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
I think you can actually have law officers who are less racist, but or not racist or anti-racist, but the whole framing of policing itself is this is what I'm talking about. You understood the history and systems of these institutions. It's based in that. And I would say the partnership aspect of what Kimm is, and I actually taught in a social work program, and I would definitely say that the partnership, and this is important, and this is where a lot of the conversations that, you know, for whatever you take on is around abolishing police or reforming police, things of nature, and even understanding how law enforcement is trained and the militarization of law enforcement. Like that's a serious, if you want to have a conversation around the complexity or real change, it has to be a multimodal approach. It cannot be, let's just fix social work, right? And it has to have all these pieces of the ecosystem that are around children and families that need to actually be addressed. And that's how, you know, I think a place is serious about real change, real transformation actually, is who all's at the table, right? Like social workers cannot only talk to social workers to improve social work. Psychologists cannot only talk to other psychologists to improve mental health. It just doesn't make any sense because in the individual, and you can just look at this just in our own lives, has so many touch points in these multiple systems that will impact my health, right? Mental health and physical. And if you really want to have true transformation, it has to have these ecological conversations. And we, you know, social workers talk about Bradford Brenner stuff all the time. And if we don't have that kind of real check, if you will, then some of even the questions we're addressing now are hopefully these aha moments of, oh yeah, law enforcement should be in the room when we're talking about this, right? The medical profession should be in the room we're talking. Primary care docs should be in the room we're talking about this, right? Schools obviously should be. Anyway, that's my point. It has to be.
I would say that is a very important point that Dr. Leon is making, and I will say that in Broward, you know, we have people who are on fire about getting access to the anti-racism training, particularly with George Floyd and the momentum that's happening with Black Lives Matter and over the summer and all of that, and they you know, county, please come train our agency. And the answer is always no. It doesn't matter where the request comes from. You will send your folks to the training in a heterogeneous environment where we get an opportunity to hear and learn and explain and explore together. We cannot do this in isolation. We will not dismantle it in isolation. We have to be at the table, and relationship is part of the process. And you can't build a relationship unless you're in the room together. And so there is, every single training session is a mixed group of community members and physicians and attorneys and social workers and, you know, police officers, and you name it. It has to be that way.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to the next question. That was powerful. Ben, how does this work in support of children and families build power for system impacted people rather than deliver services?
So, I just want to start by saying that systems can't empower people.
Come on,
right?
come on, Kim.
People have inherent power, they have inherent dignity, and they have inherent worth. And systems need to recognize that and ask the question, how can I best serve you? What do you need? And the answer might be nothing. I need you to get off my damn doorstep. And that has to be okay with the system, right? Like, right. So, there is this concept of systems sharing power. And, I would say that the example that I used with bringing former child welfare parents into the room to make decisions about which agencies get money is a step in the direction of sharing that power, because that gives a voice in the decision-making process where actual resources are allocated to the community. I think that's an honest and fair, transparent way to say, we recognize we are not the experts and we need your voice at the table, and you are not just a token to come to a meeting once a month, but you get to roll in the decision-making process. But, community needs to tell us what power looks like for them. And when they're in a state of empowerment, what that looks like for them and what they need from us as systems in order to perpetuate more of that, in order to support the development and growth of that.
Can I add just one thing to that, and then I'm gonna shut up, because one thing in some of my community work, what's also clear to me is that many people in communities, in order to even harness their natural power, need to it's a privilege. These conversations are privileged conversations for us, right? So this idea that we actually need to center ourselves in the fact that people oftentimes are not given the privilege of in time to create a vision for their optimal self, right? And that's an important piece, because if you don't have that vision, then when somebody's handing you something, you might go for what you know, which is the lesser thing. You don't know that there's something up here. So in this kind of with these power dynamics, I think part of it is communities themselves need the space and sometimes even the facilitation or guidance from professionals who care about them to say, yo, dream, like sit back and dream. And then, as a kid growing up in the city, there's oftentimes, we didn't even look at stars, right? We didn't know that stars exist till we left the city, because we didn't have time to look up, So I think there's something real about that dynamic. This is, that question elicits that for me. And Kim's response also elicits that part of like, but people need to realize they have, not only they have power, right? And people around them need to realize they have power, but let's vision with that power. Like, this is not to take what they give us,
Exactly. Thank you, Leon. Ned, go ahead. And then we have one last question.
Super quick. I think the rewiring work is not only showing different outcomes and different ways for money to move, but it is also putting on the table, do you asset frame or do you deficit? And the sector overwhelmingly deficit frames. And what I have seen is when staff have been liberated, to make different decisions, all of a sudden they're asset framing, because they're starting to see where are the points of real power. And I'm going to shut up a lot more, because I'm not solving your problem. I'm going to shut up and listen to what your path is. Right. There's real beauty in that.
Yeah. Thank you. Here's our last question for the panelists. Are people aware that between 25% and 37% of children experience an investigation by Child Protective Services during childhood? And it is approximately 50% of Black children. That is absolutely insane. Do we really think that between 1/4 and 1/3 of American children are so endangered their families should be investigated? Why do we always think about foster care instead of the front end of the system? Thank you, Emily. Kimm ready to go. Go, Kimm. And then, I'm gonna do it in this order: Kimm, Ned, and Leon.
So So yeah, people really do think that Black families are endangered and are in a deficit situation, and it's referred to in the research as visibility bias, and Dr. Caldwell can talk about that, ad nauseum, I am sure. But it all ultimately, Emily, it all comes down to racism. People see Black families and they see Black communities as less than, deficit-based, needing services and supports, incapable of taking care of themselves, bereft of strengths and resiliency factors and resources that they can use to bring to the table to solve their own problems. It is an issue of racism. It is an issue of racism. And so I don't think that this panel is focusing on foster care services. We are talking about a dismantling of the entire system. From mandated reporter and what that means, all the way to just decimating families, never to be reunified again, and what that means for outcomes in every other system that all of those kids are going to end up touching at some point.
Thank you, Kimm. Beautiful. Ned?
Yeah, it's a bit like the discussion I had about restraints in Tennyson. We have to not only do something about it, but to Kimm's point, we have to sit in it and ask ourselves why is it happening. We can't just solve the problem and pretend there were no foundational roots to that problem. And so we will get to a better place if we can sit in and say, how in God's name are 58% of the Black children being investigated in this country? That is outrageous. It is unacceptable. And what role am I playing in that? Right. And we have to ask that really hard question. I think she's absolutely right that the solution to this is to rewire the way money moves around asset frame, strength-based, community-driven work, because nobody should be looking at these kids this way. It's outrageous.
Thanks, Ned. Ned just dropped the Cardi B line in. He said, "Make money move."
So I would say, the real insanity is that we know this and we keep going with it.
Okay.
That's the real insanity. So that's not Cardi B, that's somebody else dropping a mic. But it is clearly to me, an issue of are complicit. A lot of the Black Lives Matter things. I love the diversity in the movement and how many of my white neighbors, and I use that loosely, or non-Black neighbors, I would say, who are holding signs saying, white complicity is not acceptable, or silence, is complicity. And I think for those, even to the previous question around power, for those who are listening in and have positions of power, and by the way, we all have positions of power, and we know this data now. This is why, to me, it's just probably why my energy is always high, and I do a bunch of what seems to be random stuff that all goes into one big understanding of how do we make humanity different or do something, disrupt the whatever. The point is, there are ways in which everyone in this conversation has power. Yes. And the insanity is when we don't use our local power.
Yes.
To write this, to look at that number and not only be disgusted that it exists, but not ask some of the profound questions that Kimm and Ned are asking around just even thinking about the intricacy of the system and having this is really where the dichotomy of either you're racist or not racist. Either you're going to treat people with equity, fairness, humanity, or you're not. There's no such thing as being a little bit pregnant. This is either, and I think that level of, there's no gray in some of this stuff. So the insanity is that we allow ourselves to in our system to exist in this grayness and ask questions about if it's good or not, or how can this exist? And it exists because we allow it to exist. We are the system, so to speak.
And we're here, and we're here to break it up. And I'm going to let Kimm have the last. Kimm, you have the last point here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dean Detlef.
Okay, so yeah, I just want to say that people say, "Oh my God, you're so brave for doing this work. We can't believe you're doing this work." And I would say to everybody that's on the webinar today that the work requires bravery.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I don't really share my personal story very much, but I am a survivor of the child welfare system, and I was adopted by a white family who threatened to sue the state of Illinois because they said they couldn't adopt me because I'm Black. And my father raised me to be bold and audacious in the face of adversity and fearless in action. That is the mantra I grew up in, and we spent a lifetime working towards equality in that little family. And so I would say to you, be bold and audacious in the face of adversity and fearless in action, and help us dismantle this racist system and build something that supports African American families, and by extension, all families in the future.
Awesome.
Drop that mic. Can we get Dr. Levin? Thank you, Kimm. Beautiful. Dr. D.
Thank you all. Thank you, Leonard, for your excellent moderating skills, and thank you to all of the panelists. We really appreciate all of the work that you're doing to move us towards the road to abolition. So thank you all for being here and being part of this event today. So we've heard from what some of you have been saying in the chat, that this conversation seemed more about reform than about abolition, and we wanted to take a minute to address that. We really wanted to close the session with a panel of people who are doing some work on the ground that's addressing the road to abolition. As we said yesterday, we recognize that the system can't be abolished tomorrow. So in the work of abolition, we talk about reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms. Reformist reforms expand the reach of the system. They add new funds or they add new positions to the system in the guise of reform. And ultimately, what we know those reforms do is increase the harm caused by the system to Black and brown people. But abolitionist reforms work to shrink the size and scope of the system. Abolitionist reforms work toward abolition, and that's what we wanted to highlight here. If fewer kids are entering foster care in Broward County and through the Tennyson program in Colorado, that moves us closer to abolition. As our panelist Joyce McMillan said yesterday, abolition is about shrink, 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 gone. And that's what we wanted to highlight here. So as we close, we want to share with you our call to action, so that you can stay engaged in this work and we can stay engaged with you as we work together toward abolition of the child welfare system. As we've said many times over the course of these 2 days, this is a collaborative movement, and we want to continue to hear from you and to learn about what you're doing in your own communities. And this call to action is printed in the convening program. If you haven't yet received a copy of the program, it's available at our website, upendmovement.org, under the events tab. And the first call to action is stay connected. As we said, we want to stay connected with the people who are reimagining how our society cares for children, families, communities. You can review what the Up In Movement commits to accomplishing and add your name to the growing network of supporters by signing our pledge that's available on our website, upendmovement.org. Follow us on Twitter at UpInMovement and use our hashtags, #UpEnd and #UpInMovement. And lastly, we want to know what you're doing to upend systems and create alternatives to the existing child welfare system. So please share with us your organizing, your strategies, your practices, anything that you're doing or that your organization is doing. You can email us at info@upendmovement.org.
So second, we would like you to help us help disrupt the narrative. We saw throughout the chat people describing problematic narratives that exist in the child welfare system. We know that a pervasive narrative exists that child welfare is filled with children who have parents who are bad parents doing bad things, and that children are suffering from abuse and need to be removed. But this narrative really blames individual families for larger societal ills. Even that last question that talked about how many children will experience an investigation in their lives, that's not the predominant narrative. Predominant narrative is that we're taking the right kids. And so how do we shift this predominant narrative to be about the trauma of child welfare and what families actually need to be safe and to thrive? Changing the narrative about children and families is a central element to questioning the current system, having honest conversations, even when we disagree or we're not all on the same page, and charting a new path. So now is the time to be louder, more present in this space on social media, in dialogue with one another, or in your own writing and research. Now is the time to disrupt these dangerous narratives. So yes, please join us in that.
Third call to action, commit to ongoing learning. The work of upending the system requires all of us to work together, learning from one another, deepening our analyses, and sharing our knowledge. So help us make the case that there's a better way to support and protect children and families. Share the information and data that you have, both qualitative and quantitative, that support this effort. And in particular, we invite you, when possible, to share stories about the experiences of children and families who've been involved with the child welfare system. What's been helpful, what's been harmful, and what can we collectively imagine that can be better? We know that others are building a strong knowledge base about abolition theory, vision, and practice in child welfare, including Columbia Law School, which is having a symposium next spring on this very subject. So that symposium, which is titled Strengthen Bonds, Abolishing the Child Welfare System and Re-envisioning Child Wellbeing, is being organized by the Columbia Journal of Race and Law, and you can learn more about that by visiting their website.
Next, contribute to local efforts. This is a bit about what Leon was talking about at the end about power being local. Change is needed and change is happening in communities at the state level and nationally. So seek out and join local efforts if you aren't already a part of them. But local efforts that are working towards dismantling family policing, developing alternative community supports for children's safety and well-being, and building new policies and programs to address root causes of family needs. Share the work of upEnd with those local networks and communities, but also share your work with upEnd too.
And finally, build the movement with us. Over the coming months, we plan to hold additional convenings for those who are interested in conversations and work groups centered around identifying the road to abolition. While our agendas aren't firmed up yet, we are currently brainstorming, and we'd love to get feedback from you about what those conversations should involve. So reach out to us at info@upendmovement.org if you're interested in joining us with this more in-depth collaborative work. And then before we close today, there are many people that we want to thank for helping us plan and organize this symposium. We want to give a big thanks to both of our communications teams at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, our Director of Communications, Kanice Warren, our event specialist and behind-the-scenes producer of this event, Renia Butler, and also Krista Ellis and Danielle Perez for their support. And at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, Director of Communications, Jessica Pica. We really appreciate all of the work that you've done for months and months to help us plan this event. We really appreciate all that you did to make this a successful event. We also want to thank our funder, Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, for their continued trust in and support of this work. And lastly, to all of our speakers and panelists, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your expertise with all of us. And then thank you to each of you who are watching. Thank you for asking your questions. Thank you for contributing in what was a very lively chat over these past couple days. We appreciate all of your engagement over these last 2 days. Please stay connected to us and stay tuned for future events and conversations. Thank you all very much.